Look at this mess. Are you deliberately trying to defy your superiors or something? It's utterly filthy. Do you even have eyes? Brittany growled, the building's head of sanitation, her face contorted with anger as she confronted Mateo, the new black janitorial staff. Mateo's eyes followed her finger as it pointed to the gleaming surface. But, I just polished it, ma'am, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Brittany sneered, snatching a half-eaten plate of food from a nearby table. Oh, really? Let's see how effective you really are. With a violent motion, she flung the plate across the room. A greasy mixture of food and sauce exploded against the pristine window, slowly trickling down the glass. Brittany leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. Now clean it, and if it's not spotless this time, you're fired. Got it? Have you ever experienced humiliation, discrimination, or contempt in an organization where you've worked? Before we continue with today's story, please leave a comment as number 9 if you completely agree that everyone in this world deserves respect and to be treated humanely and fairly, regardless of their race, skin color, or cultural background. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from. It was dawn at Sterling Financial, a behemoth built on astute investment strategies and operations in tech and MMO systems. The skyscraper, a symbol of power etched against the morning sky, thrummed with the energy of impeccably dressed executives laden with status symbols, monogrammed briefcases, imported water, and an untouchable aura of authority. A dilapidated scooter coughed and sputtered as it pulled up to the building's entrance, a discordant note in the orchestrated symphony of affluence. From the scooter stepped Mateo Ramirez, clad in faded work clothes. His worn backpack, a stark contrast to Sterling Financial's ostentatious display, was his faithful companion on these early mornings. He was unremarkable, just another face in the city's anonymous workforce. Yet, unbeknownst to all, Mateo was actually Miguel Sterling, the estranged son of the company's founder and newly appointed CEO, heir to it all. However, today he didn't come with his inheritance, nor as the position of the boss. He came as an unknown, without any rank or position in society. For years, Miguel had lived a separate life, pursuing social justice work that his late mother, a fervent advocate for the underprivileged, would have championed. His father, Victor Sterling, a white man with great career ambition, had remarried and continued to run the company with all of his humanity. But Miguel had heard troubling whispers, allegations of worker exploitation, stratification discrimination, unfair advancement appointments, intimidation tactics, and certain racial groups being treated unjustly within the Sterling financial empire. He decided he needed to see it for himself and expose the truth. Adjusting his backpack, Miguel approached the imposing doors, instantly feeling the weight of invisible eyes. Well-dressed employees eyed him with thinly veiled disdain. 2 perfectly coiffed receptionists exchanged condescending glances. And then there was Julian Holt. Julian, a vice president with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, stood as a gatekeeper to Sterling's inner circle. He was impeccably groomed, radiating an almost palpable sense of entitlement. Julian considered himself the guardian of the company's image, a role he interpreted as excluding anyone he deemed unsuitable. Miguel clearly didn't fit his criteria. As Miguel approached the entrance, Julian cast him a piercing look, a sardonic smile twisting his lips. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with barely disguised contempt. Hold it right there, buddy. The maintenance entrance is around back. Miguel stopped, the insult stinging like a slap. He slowly turned, meeting Julian's cold gaze, and allowed the venomous words to sink in. Miguel could have revealed his identity right then. He could have leveled Julian with a single sentence. But something held him back. A plan was forming, a way to understand the rot that had taken root. Instead, he offered a harmless smile, adjusting the strap of his backpack. Actually, he said with studied humility, I'm here about the janitorial position. I'm Mateo Ramirez. I saw the ad online. I really need this job, sir. Julian raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping Miguel from head to toe with unconcealed disdain, as if he were a stain on the company's polished image. A ripple of stifled laughter spread through the reception area. A few impeccably dressed employees snickered, as if the very idea of a poorly dressed black Latin man working within the hallowed halls of Sterling Financial was a ludicrous joke. Julian folded his arms, his eyes flashing with menace. "A job, huh?" he sneered. "You think you have what it takes to work here?" Miguel returned his gaze, his expression maintaining a careful neutrality, concealing the anger simmering beneath. "Yes, sir. I'm a hard worker, and I'm willing to learn." A cruel laugh escaped Julian's lips. "Well, sorry to disappoint you, but we're not a charity case," he said, turning away, dismissing Miguel like an irritating fly. "We have standards to maintain." Miguel didn't back down. "With all due respect, sir," he persisted, "I'm willing to do anything, even an entry-level position." Julian sighed dramatically, as if Miguel's presence was an unbearable burden. "Oh, for Christ's sake," he said, his voice laced with exasperation. He gestured to the female receptionist, who was doing her best to stifle her amusement. "Veronica, darling, would you please humor him and see if there's a vacancy around here that might suit him?" Veronica, her perfect makeup barely concealing her delight, clicked away at her keyboard. After a deliberately long pause, she looked up, her eyes sparkling with malice. Well, it seems we actually do have a position open," she announced, glancing at Julian. Julian smirked. "Oh, really?" Veronica let out a high-pitched giggle, lowering. "Yeah, exactly. It's true that the cleaning team is recruiting. Heard they're really short on staff." A wave of suppressed laughter erupted in the reception area. Julian turned back to Miguel, his smirk widening into a predatory grin. "So, what do you say? Feeling lucky? Opportunity knocks, doesn't it?" Miguel tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. The contemptuous glances, the whispered insults, the thinly veiled mockery. He understood, with chilling clarity, that this wasn't just about a job. It was about establishing a hierarchy, reinforcing a system where people like him were destined to subservience. And in that moment, Miguel Sterling made a decision. He straightened his shoulders, his gaze hardening with resolve. With a slow, deliberate nod, he looked Julian directly in the eyes and said, "I'll take the job." Julian blinked, slightly taken aback by Miguel's unexpected acceptance. "You're serious?" Miguel reiterated, his voice clear and unwavering. "I said, I'll take the job." Julian threw his head back and roared with laughter. The other employees joined in, making no attempt to stifle their amusement. They shook their heads in disbelief that this seemingly proud man would demean himself to such a lowly task. But Miguel remained unfazed. A fleeting smile touched his lips, because they didn't know what they had just done. They had just given Miguel Sterling, the future CEO of Sterling Financial, a front-row seat to witness the ugly truth of their prejudices. They were completely unaware of his real identity, and they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget, because things were about to get very, very interesting. You might think that getting the job means things are getting better for Miguel, but the real challenge has just begun. Dear viewers, have you ever seen a shadow of yourself in this story when you are in a place where you are constantly treated as if you are inferior, where every word and action is a reminder that you don't belong there? Have you ever had to endure blatant discrimination just because you are an ordinary person, even lower in status than them? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like the video to add fuel to this story. And so, Miguel Sterling, the secret heir to Sterling Financial, donned the worn uniform, armed himself with a mop and a bucket. He hadn't been working for an hour when the painful truth became apparent. He wasn't just unwelcome, he was a target for what was about to unfold. The sterile hallways of Sterling Financial were monuments to success, polished to a blinding sheen by generations of anonymous workers, none of whom had ever been a CEO in disguise. However, to everyone in the building, Miguel was nothing more than the new cleaner, and no one made this clearer than his supervisor. Her name was Brittany Wilcox, a platinum blonde with porcelain skin and a frigid air of superiority. A perpetual scowl seemed to be etched onto her face, a constant reminder of her self-appointed authority. Brittany had clawed her way up the ranks at Sterling Financial, and she took immense pride in her position, seeing herself as a guardian of the company's standards. In her eyes, Miguel was a challenge to that authority, a symbol of everything she despised, and she was determined to break him. The harassment began almost immediately. "Hey, scrubber!" Brittany's shrill voice echoed down the hallway. Miguel, his grip tight on the mop handle, turned to face her, his gaze steady despite the rising tide of anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. Miguel glanced down at the mop, then back at her. "Cleaning, ma'am." Brittany's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneering smile. "Don't get smart with me. I don't like your kind thinking you can just waltz in here and pretend like you know what you're doing. You're not worthy to lick the floors of this building." Miguel simply stared, remaining calm and unaffected. He wanted to gauge the depth of her prejudice, and he wasn't disappointed. Her venom ran deep, fueled by years of unchecked power and a desperate need to feel superior. Brittany not only disliked Miguel, she took every opportunity to belittle, demean, insult, and abuse him whenever she had a chance. If he waxed a glass door, it was smeared. If he mopped a floor, it was not up to standard. No matter what task he did, Brittany had some reason to find fault with. She not only berated him, but she humiliated him in front of many people. "Are you an idiot?" she snapped and berated Miguel one morning after he had finished mopping a conference room. Miguel, however, remained unfazed. He was as calm as usual. "What did I do wrong?" Brittany flashed her sharp, sword-like eyes and glanced to the nearby staffs with a sour, sarcastic smirk. "You did nothing wrong?" she laughed with an obnoxious ridicule. "Geez, I don't know. Maybe you don't know what to do after wiping the floor like a little child. Huh." All nearby staffs were staring and chuckling behind their backs. Miguel still did not react. He wasn't affected by their taunt or their attitudes. He tried to glance around to memorize all the faces, and he knew that they were mocking him now, but they will face the consequences for their action very soon. And just when Miguel thought the situation couldn't get any worse, Julian appeared. Yes, Julian Holt, the racist manager with a penchant for tailored suits and a thinly veiled air of disdain. The very man who had ridiculed him on his first day. Julian, completely oblivious to the fact that the scruffy black Latin cleaner he had so easily dismissed was about to hold his entire future in his hands. Julian sauntered into the hallway where Miguel, as Mateo, was meticulously cleaning the floor on both hands and knees. Well, well, well. Miguel didn't need to turn around to feel the smug satisfaction radiating from Julian. "Look at you," Julian drawled, crossing his arms, his tone dripping with condescension. "Guess we found the perfect position for you, Ramirez, eh?" Miguel exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the scrub brush. Not yet, he thought, not yet. The game was just beginning. He wouldn't reveal his hand now. The reward would be so much sweeter. Fueled by a toxic blend of arrogance and prejudice, Julian seemed to make it his personal mission to torment Miguel's life as Mateo. He would deliberately litter the floor right after Miguel had carefully cleaned it. He'd spill his imported water and demand Miguel clean it up immediately. He would use phrases like, "Clean this up, muchacho," at every opportunity, subtly reminding Miguel of his perceived inferiority. And worst of all, he orchestrated these humiliations in front of other employees, turning Miguel's daily work into a public spectacle. Some joined in the laughter, some remained silent, averting their gaze, and a select few observed Miguel with an intense curiosity, as if something about him didn't quite fit. His demeanor too calm, his gaze too knowing, too steady, and the way he endured the insults without showing a flicker of emotion, almost as if he was studying them, dissecting their motives. But the relentless abuse continued, escalating by Brittany Wilcox, the cold-blooded supervisor, until one afternoon she crossed a line that Miguel couldn't ignore. He had just finished meticulously cleaning the executive conference room, ensuring every surface gleamed, when Brittany stormed in, her porcelain skin flushed with manufactured rage. "What is this?" she snapped, her voice shrill and grating, pointing a manicured finger at the perfectly polished mahogany table. Miguel blinked, his expression carefully neutral. "It's a table, ma'am. I just finished cleaning it." Brittany scoffed loudly, her eyes blazing with contempt. "Look at this mess. Are you deliberately trying to defy your superiors or something? It's utterly filthy. Do you even have eyes?" Miguel glanced at the gleaming surface, searching for any imperfection, any justification for her outburst. I assure you, ma'am, I cleaned it thoroughly. Brittany's lips curled into a venomous smile. Are you sure about that? Then, without a moment's hesitation, she grabbed a plate of half-eaten food from a nearby table. With a violent motion, she flung the plate across the room. A greasy mixture of food and sauce exploded against the pristine window, slowly trickling down the glass. Brittany leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. Now clean it. And if it's not spotless this time, you're fired. Got it? Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. A few passing employees froze in place, their eyes wide with shock. Miguel inhaled slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Now he thought, the real show is about to begin. Because what Brittany and Julian didn't know, what no one at Sterling Financial suspected, was that their carefully constructed world, built on arrogance and exploitation, was about to come crashing down. Miguel Sterling had been playing the long game. He had endured their taunts, their insults, their blatant attempts to break him. They thought he was just a lowly janitor, an invisible nobody not worth their attention. But what they didn't know was that he was about to become their judge, their jury, and their executioner. The reception phone rang shrilly, its jarring sound cutting through the tense silence in the executive conference room. Veronica answered quickly, her voice holding its usual veneer of professionalism, until her expression underwent a visible shift, a wince of disbelief, followed by a rising tide of panic. Because the person on the other end of the line was none other than Victor Sterling, the founder, the CEO, the man whose name was etched in gold on the building's facade, the man whose vision and ambition had built the Sterling financial empire. And he was on his way up here right now. News of Victor Sterling's imminent arrival spread through the Sterling financial skyscraper like wildfire. Executives meticulously adjusted their silk ties. Secretaries frantically rearranged stacks of documents, and excited whispers echoed through the sterile hallways. The big boss was coming, but no one, not a single soul within those gilded walls, was more thrilled than Julian Holt, for he saw this as his golden opportunity. In Julian's meticulously crafted success story, this was the moment for him to shine before the CEO. Oh, he could almost taste it. Exchanging a firm handshake with Victor Sterling, discussing the company's strategic growth, perhaps even securing a coveted promotion, a validation of his self-perceived brilliance. As for the cleaning man, Julian gave Mateo Ramirez not a second thought. In his mind, Miguel, disguised as the humble Mateo, was just an insignificant background figure in his perfectly orchestrated corporate drama, a cog in the machine that he confidently controlled. But he was about to receive a harsh and unforgettable lesson in humility. Then the moment arrived. The elevator doors chimed, and a collective silence descended upon the reception area. Victor Sterling had arrived. A towering figure with an imposing presence, clad in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, emerged from the elevator, his face a stern mask of authority. His very presence commanded respect, a silent testament to his power and influence. Following close behind him were perfectly coiffed assistants, formidable bodyguards, and a retinue of senior executives, each moving with practiced precision. As Victor Sterling strode forward, every individual in the room unconsciously straightened their posture, instinctively aligning themselves in obsequious deference. Julian puffed out his chest, deftly adjusting his tie knot. Brittany, the ever-vigilant supervisor, smoothed down her designer blouse, already envisioning currying favor with the CEO, perhaps even earning a commendation for her unwavering dedication to upholding the company's rigorous standards. Employees exchanged furtive glances of excitement, their hushed whispers growing in volume. This was the man they had all been waiting for, the architect of their prosperity, the embodiment of Sterling Financial's relentless success. Victor Sterling glided toward the center of the floor, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd, pausing for a moment as his eyes narrowed with cold calculation. A cryptic, fleeting smile then touched his lips, and then he uttered the words that would irrevocably alter everything within Sterling Financial. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor Sterling began, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that commanded attention without needing to raise its volume. Today marks a truly momentous occasion for this esteemed company. Collective breath was held. Julian leaned forward slightly, his anticipation palpable. Brittany wrung her hands together, her eyes sparkling with unconcealed excitement. Victor Sterling continued, his voice growing even more resonant, For years, I have dedicated my life to building Sterling Financial into an empire, driven by an unwavering hope to leave behind a lasting legacy. A company that embodies greatness, unrelenting success, and above all. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. Integrity. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Julian stiffened, his carefully constructed facade momentarily faltering. Victor smiled faintly, the smile subtle but sharp, like that of a predator. And today, he continued, his voice ringing with dramatic emphasis, I am proud to announce that my estranged son, Miguel Sterling, has decided to return to the company. Indeed, he is in this building right now. The entire room fell into stunned silence. Bewilderment spread rapidly through the crowd. Estranged son? Whispers erupted, struggling to be suppressed. His son? But I thought. Has anyone ever even met his son? Rumor has it he disowned him. In Julian's mind, the calculations began to spin. If Victor Sterling's son was about to inherit, he needed to realign his plans, find a way to position himself favorably. His eyes darted quickly across the impeccably suited executives, searching for a face that might betray an aristocratic lineage. Surely, he thought, it had to be someone with class, someone who understood the nuances of power. Brittany's carefully applied lipstick seemed to crack under the pressure of anticipation. She envisioned a young, debonair heir apparent, someone she could charm, someone who would appreciate her unwavering dedication to Sterling Financial standards. In their minds, Miguel had to be a privileged blue blood, someone who shared their values, someone who understood the language of money. That put them at ease. A wealthy and well-connected scion would surely maintain the status quo. Nothing to worry about. But then Victor spoke again, and this time, his words landed like a seismic shock tearing through the space. He has been observing us, learning about the inner workings of Sterling Financial from a very unique perspective. Miguel, Victor's voice resonated through the room. Please, step forward. Time seemed to shatter. Every eye swiveled in unison to one point, colliding with each other in disbelief, searching for the mysterious heir. Julian's carefully crafted smile froze on his face. Brittany's perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed in confusion, because right then, right before their eyes, stood a man in a worn-out janitorial uniform, clutching a mop, the disheveled black Latin janitor they had so easily dismissed. Miguel, in the guise of Mateo, now stood before them all. Silence. A silence so thick it was suffocating. And then Julian's complexion paled dramatically. Brittany's jaw dropped open, her hand unconsciously reaching up to touch her perfectly styled hair. A ripple of shocked murmurs surged through the room. The man they had scorned, the man they had humiliated, the man they had treated as if he were invisible, was now their future CEO. In that instant, Julian and Brittany understood, with chilling certainty, that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Today, within the power-laden halls of Sterling Financial, Julian Holt and Brittany Wilcox were about to face the consequences of their own arrogance and prejudice. They had reveled in their power, relishing the chance to demean Miguel Sterling, when he was Mateo Ramirez, treating him as an inferior. Never in their wildest dreams could they have imagined that the man they had mistreated held their fate in his hands. But now, the undeniable truth stood before them, a haunting specter of the hubris they had so proudly cultivated. For one brief moment, time seemed to hang suspended. An unspoken fear filled the space. Julian, standing motionless beside the mahogany table, stared at Miguel, his mouth agape but unable to utter a word. Brittany, only a few feet away, felt the world she had painstakingly constructed crumbling around her. Her face drained of color, her eyes widened in horror and disbelief. Miguel Sterling, the janitor? It was an impossibility, an ironic reversal of the power structure. They had tormented him, insulted him, subjected him to their petty cruelties. And now this man was about to inherit it all? It was a reality beyond their imagination. Miguel stepped forward, his demeanor transforming, his gaze hardening with resolve. The meekness he had so carefully cultivated vanished, replaced by an undeniable air of authority. He surveyed the room, the whispers swirling around him like a gathering storm. Wait, is that The janitor? But he's just. His eyes, no longer veiled, swept across them, registering their shock, their disbelief, their dawning realization. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the turmoil. I imagine this comes as something of a surprise, Miguel said, his tone clear, even, resonating with a newfound command. The room fell silent, every eye fixed upon him. Julian's carefully practiced smile had vanished completely, replaced by a look of bewildered anxiety. Brittany looked as if she were about to faint. Miguel paused, letting the silence amplify, then turned to his father, who stood watching with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Miguel returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of the changing tides. The room now belonged to him. My name is Miguel Sterling, he declared, his voice resonating throughout the opulent space, demanding their undivided attention. And as of this moment, I am officially claiming my inheritance. I am your future CEO. The announcement reverberated through Sterling Financial like a thunderclap. Julian's posture stiffened, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and dread. Brittany gasped, her hand trembling as she instinctively reached for her pearl necklace. The employees exchanged stunned glances, their hushed whispers amplifying the tension. Miguel stood tall, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering, as if shedding a disguise. For the first time, they truly saw him for who he really was. For the past few weeks, Miguel continued, slowly pacing the room, his eyes carefully assessing each individual. I have been working alongside you, observing the inner workings of Sterling Financial from a rather unconventional perspective. A ripple of nervous murmurs spread through the room. I wanted to see how this company, my company, treats its employees when they believe no one important is watching. His gaze locked onto Julian. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Miguel deliberately moved closer. You deemed me insignificant, unworthy of your consideration. You saw me as a stain on your polished image, a blight on your carefully curated world. Julian's hands began to tremble. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for words, trying to salvage the situation, but Miguel raised a hand, silencing him. Then Miguel turned his attention to Brittany. Her face flushed crimson, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape, a lifeline, anything to avoid his gaze. She found nothing. Miguel tilted his head, his expression unreadable. And you? He said softly, his voice laced with steel. Brittany gasped, her breath catching in her throat. You felt entitled to humiliate me, to abuse your authority, to fling a plate of leftover food across the room and demand that I clean it up. Miguel let the words hang in the air, the weight of their implications pressing down on her. Then he spoke, his voice almost a whisper, but carrying the force of a thunderclap. Let me ask you something. The entire room held its breath, the silence thick and heavy with anticipation. If you had known my true identity from the beginning, would you have treated me differently? A long, agonizing silence stretched on, punctuated only by the frantic beating of Brittany's heart. Finally, she nodded, slowly, shamefully. Miguel's lips curled into a cold smile. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Now the game was truly his. In a fleeting moment of desperation, Julian clung to the hope that this was all some elaborate charade, a cruel joke aimed at him. Surely this couldn't be real. He had spent weeks demeaning Miguel, treating him as if he were less than human, and now, standing before him, still wearing the tattered uniform they had mocked, was the man who could obliterate his career with a single word. Miguel turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled employees, etching each of their countenances into his memory. Some had participated in the cruelty, some had passively condoned it, but a very few, had shown kindness, a fleeting moment of empathy. Those moments had not gone unnoticed. His gaze locked onto Julian, and after what seemed like an eternity, Miguel spoke. Julian Holt. The words landed like a physical blow, shattering the veneer of composure that Julian had desperately tried to maintain. He flinched, his hands clenching into fists, his body rigid with primal fear. He knew with chilling certainty what was coming, but he had to desperately try to salvage. Sir, Julian stammered, forcing a weak smile to his lips, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. Miguel raised a hand, silencing him. Julian's mouth snapped shut. The game was over. The power he had arrogantly wielded had been stripped away. Miguel took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Let me ask you something, Julian, he said, his voice low, deliberate, and utterly devoid of warmth. Julian swallowed hard, his throat suddenly constricting. Miguel tilted his head slightly, his eyes boring into Julian's soul. If you had known who I was, he emphasized, would you have treated me with such contempt? Would you have reveled in my humiliation? Julian froze, his mind reeling, desperately searching for a plausible lie, a way to rewrite his actions. But the truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable. He lowered his head, his gaze fixed on the gleaming floor. His voice was barely audible, a pathetic whisper, I didn't know. Miguel's lips twisted into a subtle sneer only he could feel, a contemptuous smile at Julian's attitude. I know, he said, his voice tinged with a quiet, chilling menace. Julian, that's precisely the problem. He wasn't cruel out of ignorance, he was cruel out of a deep-seated sense of entitlement, a belief in his own inherent superiority. It was a sin that Miguel Sterling could not overlook or forgive. Then Miguel's gaze shifted to Brittany. She stood frozen, her hands clutching at the fabric of her designer dress as if it were a lifeline. Her eyes were wide with fear, pleading for mercy. Brittany attempted a trembling smile. Mr. Sterling, she stammered, her voice cracking, I was simply upholding company standards. I was maintaining order. Miguel raised an eyebrow, his expression conveying utter disbelief. Company standards? Throwing plates of food across the room? Is that standard operating procedure at Sterling Financial? Brittany's face paled. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. There were no excuses, no justifications. Miguel let the weight of their actions crush them, letting the silence speak volumes. Then he turned to his father, Victor Sterling. Victor had been observing the entire scene with an inscrutable expression, his face a mask of impassivity. But Miguel saw a flicker in his eyes, perhaps regret or a dawning understanding. For the first time in his life, Victor Sterling looked truly ashamed of what Sterling Financial had become, ashamed of the culture he had fostered, ashamed that his own son had been subjected to such treatment by those entrusted with upholding his legacy. Now it was his turn to act. Victor stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Julian, then Brittany, then settling on Miguel. He sighed, his voice heavy with resignation. Miguel, he said softly, his voice filled with unexpected tenderness, what action do you deem appropriate? Julian visibly trembled. Brittany clasped her hands together, her eyes silently begging for mercy. But Miguel did not waver. His gaze hardened, his voice filled with a chilling, unyielding resolve. They're fired. Victor nodded, his face grim. Julian Holt, he declared, his voice ringing with finality, your employment with Sterling Financial is terminated, effective immediately. Julian's face crumpled, his meticulously constructed world collapsing around him. No, he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Sterling, please. I can explain. Victor ignored him, turning his gaze to Brittany. Brittany Wilcox, he continued, his voice unwavering, your position is hereby rescinded. You are no longer associated with this company. A silent scream tore through Brittany's throat. She whirled around to face Miguel, her eyes wide with desperate appeal. Mr. Sterling, I was just following procedure. I was upholding standards. Miguel raised his hand, silencing her. The curtain had fallen. And just like that, it was over. Julian and Brittany, who had reveled in their power and privilege, were now left with only the bitter taste of their own actions. But Miguel wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the remaining employees, a faint smile playing on his lips. Not all of you were complicit in this behavior, he said, his gaze lingering on a few faces in the crowd. A young woman named Sophia, who had offered Miguel a kind word once or twice, stepped forward hesitantly. Now it was her turn to be recognized. Miguel turned to his father, his voice resolute. My first act as CEO, he declared, is to promote Sofia Rodriguez, effective immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Sophia's eyes welled up with disbelief and gratitude. The scales had been balanced. For weeks, Miguel Sterling had observed, had endured their scorn, their condescension, their relentless attempts to strip him of his dignity. Now, the truth had been revealed and the guilty were being held accountable. Julian Holt, banished. Brittany Wilcox, unemployed. And the remaining employees were about to hear the words that would redefine the very essence of Sterling Financial. This wasn't just one man's personal victory. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed prejudice and abuse to fester for far too long. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Sophia's quiet sobs. The employees who had sneered at Miguel, who had whispered behind his back, who had treated him as if he were invisible, now couldn't meet his eyes. Miguel stood tall, still wearing the humble uniform of a janitor, but radiating an aura of authority and quiet strength that no one could deny. Today he was their leader. Miguel took a step forward, his gaze sweeping across every face in the room. The weight of the moment hung heavy upon them, palpable and unavoidable. Then he spoke, his voice ringing with conviction. Respect. One word, simple yet profound, cut through the suffocating silence like a beacon of hope. He paused, letting the weight of that single word sink into their hearts. Then, he continued, his voice resonating with a newfound power. Respect is not a privilege reserved for a select few. It is not determined by title, status, salary, or the cut of your suit. Respect is the foundation upon which we build a just and equitable society, and it is the bedrock of any thriving organization. Without it, we are nothing more than a breeding ground for cruelty, exploitation, and the very kind of behavior we have witnessed here today. A wave of shame washed over the assembled employees. Some lowered their heads, unable to bear the weight of Miguel's words. I walked these opulent halls as an invisible man, he continued, his voice filled with quiet sorrow. I was ignored, insulted, and subjected to countless petty indignities. His gaze drifted toward the conference room table, still stained with Brittany's act of cruelty. I was forced to clean up messes deliberately created to demean me, to remind me of my perceived inferiority. The weight of his words pressed down on them, a burden of guilt and realization. Miguel saw it in their averted gazes, felt it in the palpable tension that permeated the room. But he wasn't finished yet. And through it all, through the humiliation, the condescension, the blatant prejudice, he paused, his voice ringing with newfound strength. I learned a profound truth. The entire room held its breath, awaiting his final revelation. Those who seek to belittle others, those who take pleasure in demeaning and diminishing their fellow human beings, do so out of fear. Miguel's gaze swept across the faces of the assembled employees, his eyes filled with quiet determination. They are afraid of change, afraid of equality, afraid of a world where power is not defined by privilege or lineage, but by integrity, compassion, by an unwavering commitment to justice. A palpable electric feeling coursed through the air, for his words resonated with a universal truth that everyone in that room recognized instinctively. That era ends today. You could hear a pin drop as Miguel delivered his pronouncement. These weren't just empty platitudes. They were a promise, a commitment to a fundamental shift in the very DNA of Sterling Financial. Miguel turned toward his father, the man who had single-handedly built this empire from the ground up, the man who had entrusted its management to others, only to discover that some of those individuals had been steadily eroding its very foundation. Victor Sterling nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and regret. He wasn't just looking at his son. He was looking at the future, a future he now entrusted to Miguel's capable hands. Effective immediately, Miguel declared, his voice resonating with authority. Sterling Financial will implement comprehensive new policies to ensure that discrimination, harassment, and any form of prejudice have absolutely no place within our organization. A wave of murmurs swept through the room, but no one dared to challenge his decree. They knew that the old rules no longer applied. Miguel continued, his voice unwavering. There will be accountability, there will be consequences, and there will be meaningful, lasting change. Then, a genuine smile bloomed on his face, a smile that radiated warmth, compassion, and a deep-seated belief in the inherent goodness of humanity. Because this moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about inflicting pain or settling scores. It was about building something better, something stronger, something that would endure for generations to come. This company will no longer be built on arrogance, greed, discrimination, and exploitation, Miguel declared, his voice ringing with conviction. Instead, it will be built on respect, on fairness, on an unwavering belief that we all rise when we lift each other up. We will foster a culture of empathy, where every voice is heard, where every individual is valued, and where every employee is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. And just like that, the atmosphere of Sterling Financial transformed. The employees no longer just saw Miguel as their CEO, they saw him as their leader, a visionary who had charted a course toward a brighter, more equitable future. For the first time, they believed that this company was finally in the right hands, guided by a man of integrity, compassion, and unwavering determination. Miguel turned to his father, his eyes filled with gratitude and respect. Victor Sterling took a deep breath, his chest swelling with a profound sense of pride. Then he did something he had never done before. He stepped forward and shook his son's hand, firmly, sincerely. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration, a public acknowledgement of Miguel's rightful place, an unspoken truth that reverberated throughout the room. This company now belonged to Miguel Sterling, and together they would rewrite its history, transforming it from a symbol of greed and exploitation into a beacon of hope, equality, and social justice. Miguel thought that was exactly how to truly change the world, not through revenge or anger, but through the power of empathy, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to building a better future for all. What are your thoughts on today's story? What do you think about Miguel's decisions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you found this story touched your heart so you don't miss our next videos. Wishing you a peaceful day, goodbye, and see you in our next stories.